his imagination, he went over every detail of tomorrow's trip with Harriet. With his eyes shut, he seemed to see the whole occasion plainly. How she would look when she came down the path to the water, how calm and peaceful the river was going to be in the twilight, how graceful the canoe would seem, drawn up upon the shore. He imagined he lived every minute of their evening together. They would paddle to a large water lily pad upstream, and he would invite Harriet to step out on the pad and sit a while. Stuart planned to wear his swimming trunks under his clothes so that he could dive off the lily pad into the cool stream. He would swim the crawl stroke, up and down and all around the lily pad, while Harriet watched, admiring his ability as a swimmer. Stuart chewed the spruce gum very rapidly as he thought about this part of the episode. Suddenly, Stuart opened his eyes and sat up. He thought about the letter he had sent and wondered whether it had been delivered. It was an unusually small letter, of course. It might have gone unnoticed in the letterbox. The idea filled him with fears and worries, but soon he let his thoughts return to the river. And as he lay there, a whirlpool began to sing on the opposite shore. Darkness spread over the land, and Stuart dropped off to sleep. The next day dawned cloudy. Stuart had to go up to the village to have the oil changed in his car, so he hid the canoe under some leaves, tied it firmly to a stone, and went off on his errand, still thinking about Harriet and wishing it were a nicer day. The sky looked rainy. Stuart returned to the village with a headache, but he hoped it would be better before 5 o'clock. He felt rather nervous. He had never taken a girl canoeing before. He spent the afternoon laying around camp, trying on different shirts to see which looked best on him, and combing his whiskers. He would no sooner get a clean shirt on than he would discover that it was wet under his arms from nervous perspiration, and when he would have to change it for a dry one. He put on a clean shirt at 2 o'clock, another at 3 o'clock, and another at 4:15. This took up most of the afternoon. As 5 o'clock drew near, Stuart grew more and more nervous. He kept looking at his watch, glancing up the path, combing his hair, talking to himself, and fidgeting. The day had turned chilly, and Stuart was almost sure that there was going to be rain. He couldn't imagine what he would do if it should rain just as Harriet Ames showed up to go canoeing. At last, 5 o'clock arrived. Stuart heard someone coming down the path. It was Harriet. She had accepted his invitation. Stuart threw himself down against a stump and tried to strike an easy attitude, as though he were accustomed to taking girls out. He waited till Harriet was in a few feet of him, then got up. "Hello there," he said, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "Are you Mr. Little?" asked Harriet. "Yes," said Stuart. "It's nice of you to come." "Well, it was very good of you to ask me," replied Harriet. She was wearing a white sweater, a tweed skirt, short white wool socks, and sneakers. Her hair was tied with a bright-colored handkerchief, and Stuart noticed that she carried a box of peppermints in her hand. "Not at all. Glad to do it," said Stuart. "I only wish that we had better weather. Looks rather sticky, don't you think?" Stuart was trying to make his voice sound as though he had an English accent. Harriet looked at the sky and nodded. "Oh, well," she said, "if it rains, it rains." "Sure," replied Stuart. "If it rains, it rains. My canoe is a short distance up the shore. May I help you over the rough places in the path?" Stuart was a courteous mouse by nature, but Harriet said she didn't need any help. She was an active girl, and not at all inclined to stumble or fall. Stuart led the way to where he had hidden the canoe, and Harriet followed. But when they reached the spot, Stuart was horrified to discover that the canoe was not there. It had disappeared. Stuart's heart sank. He felt like crying. "The canoe is gone," he groaned. Then he began racing wildly up and down the bank, looking everywhere. Harriet joined the search, and after a while they found the canoe, but it was a mess. After someone had been playing with it. A long piece of heavy string was tied to one end. The ballast rocks were gone. The pillow was gone, the backrest was gone, the spruce gum had gone out of the seam, mud was all over everything, and one of the paddles was all bent and twisted. It was just a mess. It looked just like the way a birch bark canoe looks after some big boys are finished playing with it. Stuart was heartbroken. He did not know what to do. He sat down on a twig and buried his head in his hands. "Oh, gee," he said. "Oh, gee whiz." "What's the trouble?" asked Harriet. "Miss Ames," said Stuart in a trembling voice, "I assure you I had everything beautifully arranged. Everything. And now look." Harriet was for fixing the canoe up and going out on the river anyway, but Stuart couldn't stand the idea. "It's no use," he said bitterly. "It wouldn't be the same." "The same as what?" asked Harriet. "The same as the way it was going to be when I was thinking about it yesterday. I'm afraid a woman can't understand these things. Look at the string. It's tied on so tight I could never get it off." "Well," suggested Harriet, "couldn't we just let it hang over in the water and trail along after us?" Stuart looked at her in despair. "Did you ever see an Indian paddling along with some quiet, unspoiled river with a great big piece of rope dragging astern?" he asked. "We could pretend we are fishing," said Harriet, who didn't realize that some people are fussy about boats. "I don't want to pretend I'm fishing," cried Stuart desperately. "Besides, look at the mud! Look at it!" He was screaming now. Harriet sat down on the twig beside Stuart. She offered him a peppermint, but he shook his head. "Well," she said, "it's starting to rain, and I guess I'd better be running along if you're not going to take me paddling in your canoe. I don't see why you have to sit here and sulk. Would you like to come up to my house? After dinner you could take me to the dance at the country club. It might cheer you up." "No, thank you," replied Stuart. "I don't know how to dance, and besides, I plan to make an early start in the morning. I'll probably be on the road at daybreak." "Are you going to sleep out in this rain?" asked Harriet. "Certainly," said Stuart. "I'll crawl under the canoe." Harriet shrugged her shoulders. "Well," she said, "goodbye, Mr. Little." "Goodbye, Miss Ames," said Stuart. "I'm sorry our evening on the river had to end like this." "So am I," said Harriet, and she walked away along the wet path toward Tracy's Lane, leaving Stuart alone with his broken dreams and his damaged canoe. Chapter 10. Heading North. Stuart slept under the canoe that night. He awakened at 4 to find that the rain had stopped, the day would break clear. Already the birds were beginning to stir and make bright sounds in the branches overhead. Stuart never let a bird pass without looking to see if it was Margalo. At the edge of town, he found a filling station and stopped on to take some gas. "5, please," said Stuart to the attendant. The man looked at the tiny automobile in amazement. "5 what?" he asked. "5 drops," said Stuart. But the man shook his head and said that he wouldn't sell such a small amount of gas. "Why can't you?" demanded Stuart. "You need the money, and I need the gas. Why can't we work something out between us?" The filling station man went inside and came back with a medicine dropper. Stuart unscrewed the cap of the tank, and the man put in 5 drops of gasoline. "I've never done anything like this before," he said. "Better look at the oil too," said Stuart. After everything had been checked and the money had been paid, Stuart climbed in, started the engine, and drove out onto the highway. The sky was growing brighter, and along the river the mists of morning hung in the early light. The village was still asleep. Stuart's car purred along smoothly. Stuart felt refreshed and glad to be on the move again. Half a mile out of town, the road forked. One road seemed to go off towards the west. The other road continued north. Stuart drew up to the side of the northbound road and got out to look the situation over. To his surprise, he discovered there was a man sitting in the ditch leaning against a signpost. The man wore spurs on his legs, and he also wore a heavy leather belt, and Stuart realized that he must be a repairman for the telephone company. "Good morning," said Stuart in a friendly voice. The repairman raised one hand to his head in a salute. Stuart sat down in the ditch beside him and breathed deeply of the fresh, sweet air. "It's going to be a fine day," he observed. "Yeah," agreed the repairman, "a fine day, and I'm looking forward to climbing my poles." "I wish you fair skies and a tight grip," said Stuart. "By the way, do you ever see any birds at the tops of your poles?" "Yes, I see birds in great numbers," replied the repairman. "Well, if you ever run across a bird named Margalo," said Stuart, "I'd appreciate it if you would drop me a line. Here's my card. Describe the bird," said the repairman, taking out a pad and pencil. "Brown," said Stuart. "Brown with a streak of yellow across her bosom." "Know where she comes from?" asked the man. "She comes from the fields once tall with wheat, from pastures deep in fern and thistle. She comes from vales of meadow sweet, and she loves to whistle." The repairman wrote it all down briefly. Fields, wheat, pastures, fern and thistle, vales, meadow sweet, enjoys whistling. Then he put the pad back in his pocket and tucked Stuart's card away into his wallet. "I'll keep my eyes open," he promised. Stuart thanked him. They sat for a while in silence. Then the man spoke. "Which direction are you headed?" he asked. "North," said Stuart. "North is nice," said the repairman. "I've always enjoyed going north. Of course, southwest is a fine direction too." Yes, I suppose it is," said Stuart thoughtfully. "And then there's east," continued the repairman. "I once had an interesting experience on an easterly course. You want me to tell you about it?" "No thanks," said Stuart. The repairman seemed disappointed, but he kept right on talking. "There's something about north," he said, "something that sets it apart from all other directions. A person who's heading north is not making any mistake, in my opinion." "That's the way I look at it," said Stuart. "I rather expect that from now on I'll be traveling north until the end of my days." "Worst things that could happen to a person," said the repairman. "Yes, I know," answered Stuart. "Following a broken telephone line north, I have come across some wonderful places," continued the repairman. "Swamps where cedars grow and turtles wait on logs, but not for anything in particular. Fields bordered by crooked fences, broken by years of standing still. Orchards so old they've forgotten where the farmhouse is. In the north, I have eaten my lunch in pastures rank with ferns and junipers, all under fair skies with wind blowing. My business has taken me into spruce woods on winter nights where snow lay deep and soft, a perfect place for a carnival of rabbits. I have sat in peace on a freight platforms of railroad junctions in the north, in the warm hours and with warm smells. I know fresh lakes in the north, undisturbed except by fish and hawk, and of course by the telephone company, which has to follow its nose. I know all these places well. They are a long way from here, and don't forget that. And a person who is looking for something doesn't travel very fast." "That's perfectly true," said Stuart. "Well, I guess I better get going. Thank you for your friendly remarks." "Not at all," said the repairman. "I hope you find that bird." Stuart rose from the ditch, climbed into his car, and started up on the road that led toward the north. The sun was just coming up over the hills on his right. As he peered ahead into the great land that stretched before him, the way seemed long, but the sky was bright and he somehow felt he was headed in the right direction. And that is where our story ends. Does it end though? It stops. This story seems to stop without the main character having found what he was looking for yet. You know, we've been talking a lot about how each of our stories are unique and special. Remember, your story is unique and special, and there is nobody else who has their story exactly like yours. And when we're thinking about moving towards our goals, Stuart's looking for Margot. He hasn't found her yet, and yet the book is over. What does that mean? Does that mean that the whole story itself is done? No, that just means that this chapter of the story is over. And that there's always another opportunity for the story to start back up. There's not really ever a time where your story stops. Your story keeps happening. You may, as you think about it, you have your story from when you're a baby, you have your story from when you're a young person, and you have your story from when you reach into adulthood. Those could be all one big story. You can take a look at each individual story like one book. And that just happens to come about when you look at your story as a whole. So I'm just hoping that as you're going about making your story, and you're taking a look back at where you've gone, where you've been, and you're looking forward to where you're going to go, that you're making the choices that are going to help make your story a good one. All right, everybody. Thank you for sticking with me on this journey of Stuart Little by E.B. White. And I hope that all of you take care.